It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, Monday marks the last day of the Moon Jae-in administration. After promising to build an inclusive nation built on income-driven economic growth and social justice, Moon will leave the presidential office today, leaving behind a country that is facing soaring inflation, record debt, and high income inequality, along with low trust in government and politics. Can the Yoon administration tune into the needs of the people and turn things around for South Korea? We reflect on the last 5 years of leadership in South Korea and the next 5 years going forward with Professor Hee-eun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and Professor Mason Richey at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies in Seoul. Very warm welcome to you both. And well, let's begin with you, Professor Lee. Now, the Moon Jae-in administration over the past 5 years, it was all about building an inclusive nation, or 포용국가 in Korean, based on income-driven growth and rooting out what he called social evils to achieve a fairer society. Well, how do you think they did on that front if you were giving them a letter grade in terms of effort and achievement?
You would probably have to give them a fairly low grade. I think you think about three situations, I think, with respect to this government, outgoing government. First relates to jobs, and then second relates to the real estate market, and then sort of the Joguk scandal. So with respect to jobs, so the administration, when it came in, promised about 500,000 new jobs every year, but it only achieved, really, the economy only achieved 173,000 jobs per year. Now, that can be explained, of course, by the pandemic. But there are also other policies that the government sort of instituted that sort of limited the abilities of certain peoples, or at least the younger generation, to get jobs. And I think this is sort of a reflection of the government's sort of reaction against the market, and so not really following market-driven principles. And I think this government intervention sort of really laid into this problem of jobs. But also, I think most notably in the economic sector, the real estate market. And just things have gotten really out of hand. And so the younger generation, again, is finding it very difficult to find housing, especially in the Seoul capital region. And this is really a reaction against this, again, this market-driven principle, which really, I think, didn't really address some of the core problems related to the real estate market. And then lastly, in terms of fairness, the Joguk scandal, I think, symbolized some of the maybe underlying hypocrisy of this administration, because while Moon himself wasn't really attached to any particular scandal, those around him really sort of didn't follow through with the principles that this administration laid out. So people, they said you shouldn't own more than 2 houses in this administration, but a lot of high-level officials own 2 apartments or more. And famously, Joguk and his daughter and his wife, they were embroiled in this issue about getting admission to universities and medical school. So I think a lot of people were disenchanted by this sort of approach to the fairness issue. So all in all, a very low score.
And your take on Mr. Moon's 5 years in office, Professor Richey, as he leaves office after promising to deliver an inclusive nation, a fair society, and of course, improved inter-Korean relations?
Professor Lee just took a lot of my ideas, to be totally honest with you. When I heard that question, I also thought that really there's sort of a bitter disappointment, I think, in the fact that Moon came into office promising unity and clean government after the scandals of the Park Geun-hye administration, and he leaves office with a very divided electorate, and both to some degree around him and certainly around those who he surrounded himself with, a real stench of scandal, including the Chokuk Justice Minister scandal and the Songnam land scandal. His mixed record, I think, however, on policy, has one enormous bright spot, and that's COVID. For better or for worse, his administration is going to get credit for managing the pandemic about as well as any country on planet Earth. And the fact that the administration didn't politicize that very much, and the response to that was driven largely by science, by the epidemiologists, I think speaks well, to some degree, for how he might go down in the history books beyond some of the other problems that he's had. On North Korea, I would give him a very mixed score. Things could have been worse, I think, in terms of, potential conflict with North Korea. He does probably get some credit for the peace offensive that took place around the Pyeongchang Olympics. But of course, as things wound down at the Hanoi summit in 2019 and up until the present, obviously his policy there ultimately failed. Although, to be fair, most presidents in South Korea fail in North Korea. Also, real estate and employment for youth, that's obviously a huge problem, as we just saw. And I'll throw in also gender issues and human rights. Moon, as a human rights lawyer, wasn't able to push through the human rights law in the National Assembly, although his own party has a supermajority there. And gender issues remain a huge issue here in Korea. And frankly speaking, his party should be out in front on that. They're the Progressive Party, and yet they're not. And that their own party has now had, multiple sexual harassment scandals, in addition to not moving forward on gender equity policies here in Korea. So a very mixed record and bitter disappointment, I think.
Mr. Moon does leave on a very sort of mixed, with very mixed reviews, I suppose. But what he did manage to do is, well, his PR team was working very hard, and there were a number of brands and slogans that the government used over the last 5 years. Professor Lee, such as inclusive nation or nation-like nation, various mottos and brands. And, well, what's going to be the motto of the Yoon administration? What kind of society do you think that the incoming administration will try and achieve?
Well, I think that the biggest two mottos or the two words here are key are renewal and quote prosperity. So this is obviously a sort of reaction sort of against the last 5 years, given the economic stagnation that the country has faced. And so I think this new administration is coming in with this desire to sort of reinvigorate the Korean economy. And I think this is the topic of renewal. And then, of course, with respect to quote prosperity, questions about sort of just unemployment, again, the real estate market, I mean, the economic well-being of most Koreans, especially with inflation going up into the cost of things, as we heard earlier in the reporting here. So I think this is really the big issue is coming back out of this last 5 years and then into a post sort of pandemic era that now where the Korean economy can sort of really generate more jobs for people and then give people sort of opportunities within the real estate market to be able to own housing. And I think this is sort of the biggest sort of next 5 years. We'll see whether or not this administration will be able to really do what it says it's going to do with respect to the economy and with respect to the people's well-being and welfare.
It's clear that the South Korean people need change and they want to see tangible improvements in their livelihoods. And Professor Richey, well, the incoming Yoon administration is actually bringing back many familiar faces from the previous Lee and Park administrations. And many of its officials and advisors, they tend to be male professors nearing retirement age. So what will they really have to do in order to prove that they can bring these fresh initiatives and the reforms that people want to see in order to recover socially and economically amid various difficult conditions?
So I would lay out, 4 areas where they should pay attention. First is they should be open-minded. The second is I think they should pay attention to the concerns of youth here, let's say those less than 35. Gender, I think, needs to be something that the administration pays attention to. And to be frank, the campaign does not give you a lot of confidence that that's going to be the case. And then a willingness to compromise and work with the opposition, which, of course, has a supermajority in the National Assembly. And so domestically, if the administration wants to move forward on its priorities, it's going to have to find a way to work with the opposition up until at least 2024 when the next National Assembly elections take place. I don't think that that's very likely to happen simply because in politics that typically tends not to be the case. But I think that those are 4 areas to look for. Whether or not the team around Yoon is constitutionally capable of doing that is, I think, an open question, at least on domestic policy. On foreign policy, I happen to know a few members of the administration. Kim Sung-han, the appointee for the National Security Advisor position, Park Jin, the incoming foreign minister nominee. And they are very intelligent. They're well respected abroad. They are, I think, very global in their outlook. And so, I think that they are capable of adapting to events as they're going to happen in foreign policy, which I think is really critical for having a foreign policy that is both principled and one that is capable of dealing with events as they happen globally, because very rarely do the states' foreign policy teams have a chance to craft their foreign policy the way they want it to. So much of success and failure depends on things that are outside of their control.
And Professor Lee, in terms of improving the domestic situation amid various difficulties, the head of Yoon's transition committee, An Chol-soo, he announced 110 tasks for the incoming government last week. What do you think are some key priorities that the Yoon administration will pursue from day one?
I think most notably, probably sort of reversing the Moon administration's policy to phase out nuclear power. I think that's going to be a really big task. I think just restarting some of the construction that's been happening with respect to nuclear power plants, and getting Korea to be sort of energy self-sufficient to some degree, I think is really important. So that's one big area. Naturally, then also, cutting real estate taxes and certain regulations that really have hampered, again, the ability of people to be able to have access to housing. So not only sort of increasing sort of the burden, lessening the burden for people with respect to government regulation, with respect to housing, but also increasing the number of units available to people in sort of the region. And then I think lastly, among the 110 things, it's of course a very ambitious plan, but interestingly, I think one of them also is going to be if the new incoming Minister of Justice is actually put into place, one of Yoon's confidants as a prosecutor. I think the question about limiting the recent law with respect to limiting prosecutorial investigations, that's been also a part of the agenda I think this new administration is going to put into place in terms of figuring out how this new law is going to actually work with respect to the police and the prosecutors. And so obviously there's a lot of things going on here. And so I think that looking at 110 things that the new administration is going to do is a tall task. And I think we'll be, after this 5 years is over with, we'll look back and see whether or not those 110 things were actually accomplished during his administration.
And Professor Richey, of course, the recent presidential election that got Mr. Yoon into power, it was very polarized when it came to the voting. It's a very tight race. And how well do you think the incoming administration is going to be received by the general public? That's to you, Professor Richey.
Yeah, well, he's off to a bad start so far in terms of approval ratings. He has among the lowest approval ratings ever for an incoming president. Mostly I think that has to do with the polarization of the Korean electorate in general. But we shouldn't forget, of course, that he's, I think, already made one sort of baffling move, at least with respect to public opinion, in terms of the rushed process to move the Blue House relocation forward. Even among conservatives, that the rushed nature of that decision seemed rash and a little confusing. Also, the tense relationship between Yoon and Moon during the transition period, I think, kind of reflected badly on Yoon a little bit. Now, he has plenty of time to make up for that. And, like most presidents, he'll probably try to book some successes relatively early, and he'll probably get a bump in the polls. But, I think, certainly by the time of the upcoming local elections, we're going to get a sense, a sort of barometer sense of where he is and where his party is, and both sides, the opposition and the ruling party will have to take stock of where they are in terms of popular support as we look towards 2024 and the National Assembly elections here. And I really think one of the biggest things that will make a difference in his overall approval rating is going to be the extent to which he's willing to work with and compromise with the opposition. And I think that's going to make a difference between Yoon being a failure and being considered a statesman.
Professor Lee, the same question to you. How well do you think the Korean public is going to receive the Yoon administration when it when it takes office on Tuesday? And how will this be reflected in the upcoming local elections and the by-elections too, of course?
I mean, as Professor Richey mentioned, I mean, the depolarization, I think, that exhibited in the election, I think, is going to be reflective of what's going to happen, I think, early on in his administration. There was only about 250,000 people, voters, sort of separating between, his candidacy and Lee Jae-myung's candidacy. So this was a tightly, course, controlled election. And so I think, given that this was so close in terms of the electorate, I think there's going to be obviously people on either side. If you're progressive versus conservative, there's going to be a lot of issues that I think both sides are going to clash on. I don't expect this to be sort of a smooth presidency, but given the nature of sort of Korean politics, I think as we all have seen before, progressives and conservatives really, I think, have very deep sort of differences with respect to sort of outlook and as far as the future of the country is concerned. And so I think there is this issue about how you can work within government and how President Yoon will be able to work with the National Assembly. I think that's key here, whether or not compromises can be made. But I think in the end, it seems to me that given the trends of what's happening in Korean society, that we're going to see, I think, really, a deep sort of division within the country with respect to conservatives and progressives on a lot of these important social issues as well as economic ones. And so I think in the future, we'll see what happens in terms of whether Yoon can overcome this division. But I think it's here to stay. And I think this is going to be a problem that's going to exist within the next 5 years for this administration.
That was Hee-eun, Associate Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School, and Mason Richey, Professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.